Welcome to Headlines. This is Ari Wasserman sitting in for David Lichtenstein. Our show today is about Choshen Mishpat in the workplace, also called business ethics. How clean do we need to be? The financial issues which come up in the workplace are literally numerous, and they arise whether somebody is working in a secular workplace, a Hamish workplace, a Kodesh workplace like a yeshiva, seminary, or school. The issues are basically all the same. I just want to tell a quick story that will illustrate some of the issues that come up in the workplace. In 2004, I was working at a company and we had a downturn in revenues. So we started looking through the profit and loss statement so we could cut costs at the time. And we saw that for a company of 150 employees, where 100 of the employees were in a different location, we had a very significant office supplies expense. It was costing us $250,000 every year to pay for paper clips, copy paper, pens, and the like. And we said, this doesn't make very much sense. So we started analyzing the situation, and we saw that we had an open supplies cabinet in the kitchen that was used by all the staff. And we figured there was some leakage there. So we decided, rather than locking the supplies cabinet and having to open it every time somebody needed a pen or a paperclip, we would simply move it into the COO's office. And any employee needing supplies would know that they were under the supervision of the chief operating officer of the company. And miraculously, the expense was cut from $250,000 in half, saving the company $100,000, over $100,000 per year. So that's just an example of one of the things that come up. I've seen, we had an employee who was receiving kickbacks from vendors. We had another employee who was working for a competitor while he was working for us as well. So business ethics, Choshen Mishpat, this is a very broad category. So we are going to focus on two primary issues. Number one is going to be what people view as the small stuff, quote unquote, the small stuff, and examples abound. For example, use of office supplies for personal use, taking home the pen, using my time on the job for personal uses, charging my personal phone at work, using the copy machine at work, and how sick do I really need to be to take a sick day. And in fact, the small stuff, this was referred to recently. We read Parshas Eikev, which starts out, the Haya Eikev Tishmeunes HaMishpatim, when we listen to the Mishpatim, the halachas. And Rashi comments there, why do we have this strange form of a word Eikev, which is the name for the heel on a human body? And Rashi explains that if we are careful about the small stuff, if we're careful about the small mitzvahs that people usually trot on, they usually walk on, in other words, they don't think that they're very significant. If that's the case, then the Posek tells us, Ushmartem ba'asisim, etc., and we'll have tremendous bracha. So our question then, in this first category that we're going to be analyzing is, do we have to sweat the small stuff? Or, on the other hand, as people typically say, don't sweat the small stuff. So which is it? Sweat it or don't sweat it. So, in fact, that's a category, that area of the small stuff we're going to dabble in today, but we're going to have a full show on it coming up in the next few weeks. Today, we're going to get on to the second category, quote-unquote, the gray areas that are potentially problematic, but not definitely problematic. How do we operate in those areas? And I'll just give a couple of examples. The gray areas. Questions come up like somebody's on a trip or he incurs an expense, a business expense. He goes out to a business meeting and has dinner, and it's a valid expense, but he loses the receipt. And the question comes up, he has a blank receipt from a taxi. Can he simply fill that in the same amount? Or is that problematic? On the one hand, it does not negatively impact the company, but it's still sheker. He's filling in a blank receipt. Or, similarly, we have an employee who is working for two employers. Validly, that's okay. For example, he's a consultant working for two companies, and he has a business trip that he's able to take meetings for both of them. He goes to a conference, a convention. Can he charge both of them for his airfare and his hotel the whole amount? because really they're both benefiting and they would also both pay for him to go. On the other hand, maybe he can't do that. Maybe he has to prorate. So in fact, we'll now bring another question which we will be discussing on our show. And in fact, this is going to be the riddle that we are going to have tonight. So it goes like this. The following question was asked by somebody living in New York. He's a consultant, and he flies out weekly, either Sunday, Monday morning, flies out to Texas, and he would bring all of his kosher food with him. And there was one time that he was out there, and he was unable to eat the food. He was not feeling well. Comes Thursday, he's heading back home to New York, and he leaves the food at the hotel. He asks them, please put this in the freezer for me. I'll get it when I return next week. He comes back next week, and the hotel dropped the ball. The employee never put the food into the freezer, and what they did was they left it on a shelf. The food is now rotten. The hotel wants to make good to this treasured customer, and they decide, we'll reimburse you the $144 of your cost of the meal. And in addition, the employee has a right of reimbursement from his company, $144. The question then is, can he double dip? Can he get reimbursed from both the hotel that damaged the food and his employer who reimburses him for the expenses? And the question for our riddle of the week is, find a source in the Ohr Somayach to answer this question. So our overriding question for the day is, how strict do we need to be with an employer's time and an employer's money? And if something is not usur, does that mean that it's mutter? And if something is in a gray area, can we do it? There's a famous story told of Revitol Cilantro, who was approached by a shochet who had worked in shchita for a number of years, and the shochet lamented that the responsibilities of adhering to all the halachas of shchita on the job were too much, and he was deciding to make a change of career and go into business. And Revitol Cilantro asked him, do you know anything about Choshen Mishpat? And the shochet said, no, I don't know anything, but there's so many people in business. How difficult can it be? And Revitol Cilantro explained to him that if you think shchita is difficult, Choshen Mishpat is much more difficult, and if you know nothing about it, you are going to violate many more halachas than you could when you are involved in shchita. And unfortunately, this is a common mistake that the shochet was making, that people think that things are easy, but there's a lack of knowledge as to the requirements of Choshen Mishpat when we are on the job. Just to further frame the conversation here, the question is, what's the standard? Can we use nothing on the job, or a reasonable amount would be acceptable? So, for example, this is a philosophical difference that I have with my brother Noam. Noam is of the view that nothing personal in nature can be used on the job. For example, you can't use the copy machine, you can't print out something personal at work. But my view, at least in most business places, for most employers, is as long as it's a reasonable amount, not an unreasonable amount, but a limited amount would be acceptable. And there was a time that I needed to fly back from New York to Yerushalayim, and I asked my brother, I needed my boarding pass printed out, and I said, would you mind printing it out? I'm in a jam, I need this, need to head to the airport. And his response was, I would do anything for you, my dear brother. However, I have a strong policy of not using company or university assets, so I don't print out things for personal use while on the job. However, because I know you need this, I'll make an exception, but I'm going to be sure to replace this piece of paper with one from home. So that was my brother's view, and I am sure that he also made the university whole with the ink and the electricity that was used, but that's my brother's view. Don't use anything for personal use, and my view is a reasonable amount would be acceptable. So we're going to analyze today the very important question, who is correct? Is my brother correct? Use nothing at work if it's personal in nature, or am I correct? If it's a reasonable amount, that would be acceptable. Okay, before we get to the guests, just to explain who we are going to be speaking with today, we have an exciting slate of guests. We're going to start out with Rabbi Aharon Lopiansky, the renowned Rosh Yeshiva, who is going to discuss the hashkafic aspects of Choshen Mishpat on the job. Then we're going to speak with Rabbi Yitzchak Breitowitz, the renowned Posek, who will field a number of shilas, actual shilas from the workplace. And then we're going to introduce Dr. Rivka Schwartz, who is a professional educator who is going to discuss with us the need for educating our children as it applies to honesty and integrity from a very young age. And then we will finish the show with the famous speaker, Mr. Charlie Harary, to give us chizuk in these areas. Joining us now is Rabbi Aharon Lopiansky. Rabbi Lopiansky is the Rosh Yeshiva of the Yeshiva of Greater Washington, Tiferes Gedalia. He's a prolific author. He has written over 20 Seforim, including what we can call the Book of the Year, which fills an unbelievably necessary void, the Ben Torah for life. Rabbi Lopiansky, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, and Yeshivas Ohr for your work. The work, Make It Work, both the men edition and the women's special needs, really fills the lacuna in the world of halacha, and Be'ez Hashem, people should be able to get a lot of tells out of it.
Thank you so much. So, Rav Lopiansky, I'd like to start as follows. Your Sefer, Ben Torah for Life, it focuses on the decision to go from kollel to the workplace, and it also discusses in depth and detail the related transition and the challenges of the transition. There's an excellent chapter on integrity, and the topic of integrity in the workplace is very broad. And I'll just cite a few examples that come to mind. Using your time at work when you're on salary. Are you allowed to answer when your child calls or something comes up, or to respond to an email that's personal in nature? Using office supplies for personal use. And some very serious issues of proper disclosure. Somebody's trying to raise money for a business or get a loan. What can I expense to the company? What's reimbursable? What's on me? What's on them? Disclosures on an interview. And this is not even to mention payment of taxes, which we won't get into. So the typical yeshiva bacher, the avrech in kollel, the girl in seminary, doesn't deal with these issues growing up until really they get out to work. So what I'd like to discuss initially is on a practical level. How does someone prepare for these monetary responsibilities, whether the person is going to a secular workplace, a hamish workplace, working in a yeshiva, a religious institution? The person probably had no exposure to these issues, and in fact, they may have grown up in a family or an environment where people were lax about monetary responsibilities and how they dealt with others, cutting corners, playing financial games. So I guess my first question is twofold. If somebody is unprepared, is this a difficult transition? And number two, if so, how does somebody prepare for it?
So I think you touched, obviously, on a very, very important topic. Let me give a parallel which pales in comparison, but it's still, people will understand what's being done, and maybe you can apply it. People grow up in a yeshiva environment. People are nice to each other. People are friendly. Chesed is spoken about, and things like that. But marriage, no one knows what the underpinnings of married life is like. For many years, it was never spoken about, and in the last decades, it has become a whole an establishment where you have people giving chas and kala classes of varying levels of sophistication. But it's understood that just because he's a nice guy and she's a nice girl, putting them together will have a lot of problems that will come up that they're not prepared with, because being nice in a dorm environment and being nice in a family is two separate environments. So just like we put that into place because we understand how it's almost impossible to guess the issues, and we avoid a lot of problems by preparing them. We need to do the same here also. It's a lot more complex. Yes, there are many differences. First of all, a bacher gets married when he's a bacher. So he's in the yeshiva environment. He has clear rebbeim. And his Rosh Yeshiva / Rebbe, you can sit him down and say, okay, now we're going to do a series of chassan classes. When a person makes the transition from kollel to workplace, usually most kollim, the Rosh Kollel is either just a managing figure or maybe only devoted to learning. He's not a Rebbe figure anymore. So who will prepare those shiurim? Secondly, every Rosh Yeshiva or anybody giving chassan class is married as well. So he has at least, he has a personal feel for it. In business, if the Rosh Yeshiva, the Rav, Rebbe, never had real exposure to the business world, is also clueless. I mean, what are practices that are standard? What are practices that are okay but not okay, and things of that nature? So we need to develop a cadre of rabbinic figures who have the intimate know-how of what goes on in the business world, can explain, can make a set of courses like Choshen Mishpat, explaining the basics of what's business, what's really gray to the point of black, and what's totally wrong, and what to do. A person gets his first job, he has no money, and 2 or 3 months into it, he realizes that what he's doing is possibly very wrong, but help, what do I do? So we need to develop really a cadre of Rabbanim that can give, quote-unquote, Choshen Mishpat, can give a series of practical guidelines and understanding what goes on, what is absolutely appropriate, what is, maybe not mahadrin, and what's a lot worse than that.
Interesting. So when it comes to the Choshen Mishpat issues that come up in the workplace, I don't know if you were saying this directly or I'm implying it from what you're saying. If you have a typical Rav that you go to with your shilas, does that mean that the Rav that you go to for your a day or a Chaim issues may not be the proper address when you have the Choshen Mishpat issues that come up in the workplace or elsewhere out of the workplace?
Absolutely. First of all, it's another miktzah in Torah. The reason why we give Yorah and we give Yadin Yadin. And besides even someone who knows the Choshen Mishpat, as regards the lumdus of it, but what is the reality in the workplace? What goes on? What is considered norm? What is norm but absolutely wrong? What's acceptable? That even someone who's an expert in Choshen Mishpat, if he only learned it as in a safer form, but hasn't had experience with business people, workplace issues, and stuff like that, he may also be totally at a loss to know these things.
So the pool of Rabbanim then sounds like it's fairly limited.
I would assume, yes, they would be limited. Ideally would be obviously a Rav who had been in business at some point, and is a Rav, and now he's doing, so he has actually a first-hand feel of it. But second best would be someone who's had enough cases and involvement where he knows and understands the ins and outs of it. I believe that the pool of people who really would be able to guide somebody is kind of would be small, but we must have it.
Interesting. Now, when you go to Rav, and I'll ask the question from the Posek, the Choshen Mishpat Posek's perspective.
Right.
It seems like in the financial area, there are a lot of gray areas. You go and ask. In the olden days, you'd say, "Is this chicken kosher or not?"
Right.
Yes, no. Shabbos, can you open up a bottle? Is there borer on Seforim? Yes, no. Is it d'oraisa? Is it d'rabbanan? It's a machlokas. But when it comes to the area of Choshen Mishpat, I've seen that when I've had shilas come up, or when people have asked me shilas, and I've gone to different rabbanim, not that I was asking for myself to form shop and try to find a kula, but I'm just interested in talking about these sugyas with this different poskim, and this posek will say, asur, d'oraisa, terrible. This one will say, mutter, but not ideal, on the same shaila. And it seems that when it comes to these financial areas, you'll go to multiple poskim. You shouldn't go. You should say l'charav. But if it seems that there's not as much clarity. So does that mean that the rules are not clear? What's the result? What's that coming from?
Right. So you're touching on a very sore point, and there are 2 or 3 issues, and unfortunately, one of the resolutions for it is going to be difficult. The first reason is your idea, for instance, deals with chickens. To the best of everybody's knowledge, chickens have looked pretty much the same over the years. So once you have the dough, you're posting shach the taz, bring the kadim. So it's very clear what the chicken is and so on and so forth. Same thing is true about tzitzis and tefillin and davening. The physical object is in place. We by now have a sort of masorah of what's the default psak. And yes, one person got a hashulchan, but pretty much it's much more clear the distinction and the difference of opinions. Choshen Mishpat, the cases are different because what's a corporation, what's a limited liability, what is a stock, what's a bond, what's an investment today, considering how the government's regulating it, how do we? There is no posek of the no shach and no tumim and no ktos, and nobody of those posek dealt with it. So we now have a whole new set of chickens. We don't have chickens anymore. We have some new bria that we don't have poskim with a statute that have finalized and said this is a kurkav and that with a neck of this is the foot. We don't have that. So that's the first problem we have. Secondly, in the nature of the imamanists, the variations really make a big difference. You don't have as many variables, not even close in Deya or in Orach Chaim, so that you go with the dayan, in of rows. Those are reasons why Choshen Mishpat to start with is a problematic area, and produces the results you said. But what should happen if let's say we'd have a Klal Yisrael in the way Klal Yisrael should be constructed, an extremely functioning, united community that has a rabbanis, a rabbinical authority that is accepted by everybody. So the way to go would be to enact takanis. Signing a contract is considered a kinyan, or it's not considered a kinyan, one or the other. Any t'nai that's made that's not a t'nai kafel is considered to be t'nai kafel unless whatever. On and on. What you do is, the way you would do it is, you would a priori set takanis, which you are empowered to do. Municipal entities have the ability halachically to set takanis, and you would avoid the problems by pre-setting takanis. We don't have that, unfortunately. We have zero in terms of a united community, and therefore every bezdin is not bound by any other bezdin. And one bezdin will consider American law minig Medina, one will consider it not. One will consider this as a kinyan, one will consider it not. So now every time you enter any type of contractual relationship, you really don't know what it's going to mean. In American law and any organized society, you pretty much know what the law is going to be. So this is a really difficult area. The way to resolve it would be if we have a very strong, so for instance, if let's say the OU would have a membership that would feel bound by Bezdin, and they have one flagship Bezdin, and they would make takanas, that would be binding. I don't know the reality of how many people in that community go to Bezdin. I don't know. If Agudas Yisrael were able somehow miraculously to muster together all the major Batidinim, and they would set a priori takanas, and so that people know when they go into something what they're going into, that would help alleviate a lot of situations. Right now, the halacha is every bezdin as they see fit, unless there's a takana that's set by an appropriate, halachically it's a municipality, it's a group. You have a real issue, and there's no resolution. There's no easy resolution to it. I don't know what the answer to that is.
Mm-hmm. So what we're left with nowadays is asay lecharav, and when issues come up, you go to your local beis din if it's a dispute and have them paskin based on.
Well, what's appropriate, what could be done and should be done is to have you write in a contract which bezdin is going to arbitrate it in Torah. You will both go to bezdin X or Y or Z. If it's an established bezdin, you usually have a sense. Then they do have a track record. They consider this to be true, exactly true, and so on and so forth. that's somewhat of a remedy to anarchy.
Right. Now that's when we have disputes, but for the standard question that somebody has in the workplace, am I doing the right thing? Am I doing the right thing? Do I have to disclose Gneva Stas? Then we're left with, we go to Posek, who has expertise in Choshen Mishpat, and we have our Shaila there. Okay.
Correct.
So when it comes to all of these issues, if you look in the Gemara, for example, you see 100% hakbada, with very little flexibility. For example, there's a Gemara in Tainus that talks about Abba Chilkiah, was Choni Amagel's grandson, and he was working in the field, and a couple Talmidei Chachamim were, as representatives of Chazal, came to him to ask him to pray for rain for Klal Yisrael. He had the same power of davening for rain as his grandfather, and he didn't even turn around to acknowledge their presence and say Shalom Aleichem to them. And later on in the day, they ask him, why didn't you even say Shalom Aleichem to us? Why were you so unfriendly? And he says, Schir Yom Havi, I was on the clock, I was being paid, and I couldn't use that time up because I was responsible to my employer. And the Gemara Makos actually calls him Poel Tzedek. That is the honest worker, the ideal worker. And there's a similar medrash in Shmos Rabbah that talks about Abba Yosef Habanai, who was a builder, and he's on the top of a scaffolding. And Avnimos Hagardi, a non-Jewish philosopher, came and asked him a question, and he doesn't turn around. He says, I can speak from you from up here, but I'm a Schir Yom, I'm on the clock, and I can't speak with you right now. I can speak with you, I'm sorry, but I can't come down and have a face-to-face conversation with you. In fact, that's how we paskin in the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch. The Rambam is very explicit. He says you can't steal from your employer, even ma'at bekanu, ma'at, a little here and a little there, because everything adds up. And he brings Yosef HaTzadik that says, Ki b'kol kochi avodati achavichem, I put my whole effort. And it seems that nowadays things are a lot laxer. Nowadays that people are answering the cell phones for personal use and this and that. And I guess my fundamental question is, how strict do we need to be, and have times changed that we don't have to be as strict as required by the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam and the Gemara?
So the Gemara, for instance, Abba Chilki that you brought, you ask yourself, was that a Midas Hasidus? But the Gemara definitely singles him out as being a Yachid B'dar, and that's why he had the ability to be Mispalel and so on and so forth. So the question is, A, is that the Midas Chasidus? Or is this a getter where, like it says, Kulon B'Ravak Lashon Hara, it's just impossible to do what's right, but the Mitzvah is most everybody is somewhat nichshul. So those are two questions to ask about these Gemaras. How much as a person, it certainly should be an ideal. The Gemara presents it as a magnificent ideal, and the Rambam, when he brings it at the end of his halach, is definitely he intends to be Musa Shabo. The real, I mean, at the end of the day, the work, the halacha of how much time you can take off would depend on the contractual agreement, which is unconsciously what you expect of normal workers. And so if you expect somebody to handle one or two person calls a day, and it doesn't, people feel that if the guy feels like a slave, he's not going to be happy. But where is that line pushed or pulled is a difficult question. And that's why my assumption is today when a person employs somebody else, within reason, the person will give him a little. That doesn't mind if there's little space. Doesn't expect a machine, but at what point does that line crossed? People need to be honest with themselves, and they need to. It's tough because we all have negias. But the leeway is because you assume a normal agreement is sort of monitored by the standard. So if standard is that within a day a person will take 10, 15 minutes off for private use, that would be acceptable. But people need to ask themselves, do I honestly feel that what I'm doing is actually is honest? Or am I making excuses? You hear the type of thing, well, I work so hard for him, brought him so much money, believe me, even the hour I'm taking off is not enough. Once you start hearing things like that, it's the end of a life.
Right. I assume that it also has an impact if the person has set hours. I work 9 to 5 and I'm on the clock, or somebody is working at an investment bank or a law firm or a place that they just have to complete the work, but they don't have these set hours, so there's a little bit more flexibility.
Correct.
Okay. I think what you were saying is just comes to mind is reflected in the Gemara. The Gemara in Brachos talks about that somebody who's on the clock cannot say a full Shmona Esrei. He has to have in Havinenu, the shorten. And if you look through the Rishonim, and that's how we pass on the Shulchan Aruch, things have changed because employment standards have changed, and the assumption of the employers when they hire the employees is what would be reasonable, what's based on the industry standard at a given time. So initially, in the posting, they said now you can daven the full Shmona Esrei even if you're on the clock, and then it changed to you can even go out to minyan if it's not going to take you too long, and you can even be the chazan. So we do see that the halacha the halacha didn't change, the standard changed the same. It's just the application, the employment standards was what changed and impacted the halachas.
Right. Correct.
So. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what we're saying now is the Gemara is likely a midas Chasidus, Abba Chilkia and Abba Yosef Habanai.
It's either midas Chasidus or it's the one person who's. It's like if we say the Chachamim didn't speak Lashon Hara, well, it's not a midas Chasidus in the sense. The halacha does obligate us not to speak Lashon Hara, but since the Gemara says this is a type of Aveira that everybody's nefshel, the one person who did it right is considered to be the yotzim in Aklal. And so I think Gemara is definitely singling out Rabbi Chilkia, obviously for good reason. So either midas Chasidus or it's so difficult to keep to it that the one person who actually did it is put on a pedestal for us to look at.
Right. I live in Yerushalayim, so we were moving from one street to another, and we used a moving company. And it turned out that one of the movers was from Los Angeles. I'm originally from Los Angeles, so I started speaking to him while he was working. And it's amazing. He says to me, "Why don't we speak during the break when everyone else is smoking? I don't smoke, and I'll speak to you then." And I was so impressed that effectively I was the boss. I hired that company.
Right.
And he's telling me, I can't speak right now, I'm working right now, let's wait for my break. So I was very impressed by that. He also, the whole time, he's working back and forth, and he has headphones in, and I thought it was for his phone, if he was on the phone. And then he told me during the break, so what are you listening to? He says, well, Pesach is coming, I'm listening to Shiurim to prepare for Pesach, which wasn't interrupting his work at all. So he was able to listen to Shiurim. He wasn't going to take a break to talk to me because that would stop his working. And then we spoke during his break. So there are Abba Chilkias nowadays as well.
I guess Los Angeles produces tzaddikim. That must be the conclusion.
We won't go there. City of the Angels, Los Angeles. So to ask a question, an unfortunate question in the opposite direction, we see that we have to be careful. There is some flexibility. We build in what would be reasonable industry standard, but unfortunately we've seen that there have been a number of very public scandals perpetrated by some at least outwardly observant Jews, oftentimes financial in nature. There's somebody who was telling me that he's in Shidduchim now, and he's been set up. He's been read another of Shidduchim, and when he Googles the families, it's been about 5 or 7 times that he's found that the girl's father is in jail for financial crimes.
Right.
And the question is, in light of the clear, or at least the clear prohibitions in the Torah that they're violating, some things are gray and that has to be hashed out, but not to steal, not to be unfair in business, not to bribe people. Why is this happening?
So I think there are a few reasons that we might be able to do something. First of all, it's much harder to deal with things that are tangible than intangible. It's a treifa piece of meat, it's a treifa piece of meat. This hechsher is no good. It's very tangible. So a person has a harder time crossing that line. Choshen Mishpat is conceptual by nature. It's not a piece of something labeled a certain way. So it's much harder to, you don't have that type of restriction. That's one area that I think is problematic. It requires a certain level of dealing with concepts as they were realities. Secondly, there's a chinuch from when you're young. Don't eat this, don't talk to him, davening, get a patch, or whatever, however you do the chinuch. But it's been reinforced for 20 years, 25 years, 30 years. And that's, we've had that chinuch. We don't, when someone is growing up, there are not financial issues of integrity. They're not really allowed. The kid has spending money. I mean, a kid in a dormitory situation or in a yeshiva that's stealing is a real. It's a psychological issue. So we have very little. So we have no practical chinuch. Third of all, in the younger age, when I think a big part of our chinuch is created through stories. So we have a lot of stories about Hasmada, if you're Litvish. You have a lot of stories about Kedusha, if you're Chiddush. You have a lot of stories of tzedakah and being kind. I have a hard time thinking of stories about being honest. And besides having stories about it, you also need to translate it. For instance, would there be any books about a hero, a boy or a girl who doesn't do well in school? She or he has a chance to cheat and to get the answers and decides not to. Doesn't do that well on the test, but is very proud of himself or herself. I don't read many children's books. I would say I stopped many years ago. But are there books like that? Are there novel books, stories? If there aren't, and my sense is there are not, we don't build the sense of an honestly achieved accomplishment, whether it's money, grades, covered, is by far more rewarding, satisfying, and better than something that's dishonest. We need to put a lot of effort into creating those stories. I mean, there are many Gedolim whose integrity was, but you need to bring those stories. You need to tell those stories. You need to create a literature that will reinforce it. And you need to talk about it in ways that can speak to the kids. The kids are not going to understand something about a big business deal, but being that we see this as an issue, it has to be built in for the future. That I think are the areas. Those are the things that we're lacking and we need to do. People don't. It's taken for granted. Some kids are honest. This, that, and by and large, in that scenario, there isn't much of it. But then there hasn't been that type of reinforcement you get about sitting in your place where you're davening. How can you talk to somebody else where you don't Hashem? All that type of reinforcement, both positive and negative, hasn't happened. So I think that's where we need to rethink it and introduce it at every level until they reach that stage.
Right. So what I'm hearing is the chinuch we talked about before, the chinuch when somebody leaves kollel and needing to set up rabbanim and shiurim for this, and now it should start from a very young age that the chinuch system has to build in the importance of learning Torah, the importance of good midos, and the importance of ethics and integrity as we raise our children.
Right. That's something that that sense that honesty and emes is the greatest value, and translate it to a child that's something honestly earned. I'll share a short story of something that made an incredible impression on me. I have a relative, his name is Moshe Gans. He used to be the Mashgiach Shalabim. He's retired. He's a Yid of Hashavi, Talmud Chacham. He's a Maggid Torah for many years. Very, very special person. Really, Ish Emes, the Yoshev, I don't have to say many shvachim about him. Whoever went to Shalabim, so knows him. Their oldest son was born, I think, had some cerebral palsy issue. He limped on a foot. Things were hard for him. He worked very hard to compensate for it, not to get any special breaks because of it. A very, very special kid, Israel. I remember him. And when he was 19, he was waiting in a summit somewhere in the south to get onto the bus. He crossed, the car hit him, and he was killed. And I heard the hesped on him, And one of his rabbis said that he had given a test, and he looked at Yisrael's test, and there was a question mark with 3 or 4 parts, and it was left blank. He asked him, why did you fill it in? He said, I don't know the answer. He said, it's a 4-part question. I'm sure you could do 2 or 3 parts, and at least you get partial credit. And he said, that's not me. If I don't know, I don't want to dray a cup. I don't want to get a piece there. I mean, look, hafif, in Hebrew, the word is hafif. I'm not a drayer. I don't really know it. So if I don't know it, then I should not be getting credit for it. Those are values that speak. A kid struggles with that. And a kid has to be honest about something he did wrong, about something he didn't do. And we need to build in the sense that the most positive and rewarding religious experience for me is to be honest with myself to other people, take consequences, but be very, very proud of myself and happy with myself that I stood by the emes. That chinuch needs to go in together with everything else.
Right. Wow, that's quite a story.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Rav Lopiansky. Any final words you'd like to say to the audience?
No, I think this is a struggle for everyone. It's a struggle for people in yeshivas. I mean, people running yeshivas, there are tremendous financial challenges. There are always easier ways. Those shilos exist. My father, who had the Mirae Yeshiva on his shoulders, spent most of his time deliberating what he can and what he can't do. He didn't share his thoughts, but as much as a son-in-law could see, a lot of it was spent. Is this right? Is this not right? Can I? Should I? Is this person think he's doing this? How much are you leading a person on? How honest are you presenting it? Those affect every single person. And yeshivas, because they are financial entities and struggling financial entities, they have the same challenges. So everyone, this is even if you stay in Kolel, you need to deal with it. So those are certain HaKadosh Baruch Hu should give us Siyata Shmaya, and may our generation find the approach and the remedy that we need to build in this critical pillar.
Amen. Rav Lopiansky, a pleasure speaking with you.
HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Choshen Mishpat, so that's the seal of approval.
Amazing. Rav Lopiansky, such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, Carl. Bye.
Thank you. Joining us now is Rabbi Yitzchak Breitowitz. Rabbi Breitowitz is a world-renowned Posek and speaker. He is the senior lecturer at Yeshivas Ohr Somayach in Yerushalayim. He's the Rav of the Kehila at Ohr Somayach, and before moving to Yerushalayim, he was a Rav in the United States. He was a professor of law at the University of Maryland Law School, and I need to say, honestly, that there is nothing that I can say that can do justice to who Rabbi Breitowitz is, except for one thing I heard from Rabbi Yisachar Friend. He recently gave a shiur, and he was quoting a psak of Rabbi Breitowitz, and he said as follows: on Rabbi Breitowitz's smicha from Ner Yisrael, it says that he is an ilui atzum. And I need to say that applies not only to his being a tremendous Talmid Chacham, but to having unbelievable midos character traits as well. Rabbi Breitowitz, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Rav Harary. And again, when it comes to business ethics, you've literally written the book. I myself use your Seforim for guidance when I have shilas, and I hope you'll continue to go. May chayil el chayil.
Thank you so much. So, Rabbi Breitowitz, I'd like to start with something that happened this past Shabbos. This past Shabbos, there was a Rav a very well-known Rav from the East Coast of the United States of America, and I asked him if he gets a lot of Choshen Mishpat questions from those who daven in his shul, and he said, in fact, he gets basically none. He gets Nida Shailas, Shabbos, Kashrus, even Orla, but not Choshen Mishpat. And I wanted to start off with asking, is that your experience as well, in particular when you were a Rav in the United States? You can exclude all the questions that I ask all the time, but when you were a Rav in the United States, for example, was that something that was lacking?
No, there is no question. I think the experience of every Rav is that Choshen Mishpat, business ethics questions, are far and few between. There's a famous joke in which a rabbi asked a congregant, "Why you never ask me business shilas?" And the congregant answered, "Rabbi, I don't tell you how to run your business, don't tell me how to run mine." Many people do have an attitude that business is kind of separate from religion, and they can make their own judgments, and they could follow prevailing societal norms. And that's very, very unfortunate. I mean, as you know from the Shulchan Aruch itself, Choshen Mishpat is one of the 4 Chelkei Shulchan Aruch. It is very, very large, it is complex, it is vast, and there are many, many Torah prohibitions involved in taking money that you're not entitled to take. And the very first question that Hashem is going to ask us after 120 years is Nasasa v'nasata b'yamuna, did we conduct our business affairs with honesty and with integrity? Now, I will say this. I will say that I think there has been a bit of a turn to the better. I think more and more Rabbanim are starting programs in Choshen Mishpat, both within the Yeshiva world and maybe even more importantly in the Balabatisha world. And just as the Chafetz Chaim kind of spearheaded a renewal of consciousness regarding the importance of speech and the laws of Lashon Hara, I think we are seeing, perhaps in wake of these scandals, financial scandals that pervade society, maybe a renewed dedication towards honesty in business. So I do detect, at least on a small scale, a movement towards a greater involvement in Choshen Mishpat.
Very good. So our focus here is Choshen Mishpat. We're going to focus on the workplace in general, be it an employee or an employer. And I just wanted to ask, what should be our general approach when something comes up? Always be machmir. Obviously, one approach is sticking your head in the ground. Should we ask a posek every time that the smallest thing comes up, or should we ask our employer what's acceptable or what's not acceptable? What should be our general approach to the issues that we encounter?
Well, there is also another famous story that Revitol Cilantro at some point in his life did not want to get any financial gain from the teaching of Torah, so he decided to go into business. But he left that after a few months because he said the number of ethical shilas he gets in business is much greater than he would get in Rabbanas and Chinuch. He really felt everything was a shaila. Now, the good thing is this. The good thing is that most monetary issues can be waived with consent of the parties that are affected. So if you ask your employer, or you ask a person with supervisory authority to make certain decisions if something is okay, and the person says it's okay, then largely it's going to be okay with some exceptions. So you do have a choice. There are really 3 choices. One is to be machmir in all cases of doubt, and that's absolutely appropriate. The second is to run to your Rav, which is also very, very good. And the third is to have lines of communication and disclosure with your employer or those with supervisory authority. And the truth of the matter is, all 3 of those alternatives are pretty good because they will take you out of the morass of dishonesty that business can often entail. Let me emphasize, too, that besides the direct prohibitions of theft, stealing, and the like, particularly when you're in a non-Jewish work environment, there is the awesome and awful potential for Chilul Hashem, for desecrating God's name, which is kind of a tremendous, tremendous Aveira that is superimposed on all of the technicalities of Gezela. And every Jew must be constantly cognizant of the Chilul Hashem or the Kiddush Hashem in their particular actions. So the more open and honest you are, the better it is, even if halacha might give you a bit more tolerance than you're going to be taking.
I just want to go back to, I think you very specifically chosen language that you used, that if you're at work, you can ask somebody who has supervisory authority. This comes up a lot. Who can I ask for? Can I use the copy machine? Can I do X, Y, and Z? Can I take off an extra day that's typically not allowed? Whatever it may be. What does that mean, supervisory authority? Yeah.
This is a tricky question, and I was a little deliberately ambiguous in my response. They tell the famous story that the Chafetz Chaim once wanted to send a package or a letter at the post office, and the postal employee, in deference to the Chafetz Chaim's stature, said you don't have to pay the postage, and the Chofetz Chaim says, who says you have the authority to deprive the government of its revenue, and the Chofetz Chaim ripped up a stamp, which illustrates that just because the person behind the counter says forget about it, that is not automatically the same as a valid mechila, a valid forgiveness. So when I talk about supervisory authority, I mean this, that in every business setting, managers at different levels are empowered and authorized to make certain deviations from official rules. Perhaps there's a dollar limitation, something up to $50 or whatever it might be. So it is incumbent on you, really, to figure out what the hierarchy is, what is the ladder of authority, what decisions can be made. Now, that's not the easiest thing to find. But once you've located a situation where a given person is given a certain authority at a certain point, at that point you are permitted to rely on that in deviation of a standardized policy. I think businesses realize that there has to be a certain amount of play in the joints, but nevertheless that doesn't mean everybody makes their own decision. Typically there should be some type of person that you can turn to. Now, there may be exceptions when something is mamash, de minimis. I think we'll get into that maybe a little later on. But the term supervisory authority means a person who within the organizational structure is given the actual power to waive or modify an otherwise fixed rule of the employer relationship.
Yeah, would that typically be my direct boss who has apparent authority over making these decisions?
That will often be the case.
Okay, now, in researching our topics here today, I reached out to a number of Haverim, one who is a menahel of a large school in Queens, and I said, what are the issues that you have on the job? Does this apply also for yeshiva and a teacher and a rebbe? Do the issues that we are going to talk about apply, be it a yeshiva, a school, if you work at YU or BMG or the OU, Aguda, are these the same issues if you're working at these non-profits or yeshivas?
Yes, absolutely. There is no such thing as being allowed to cheat or defraud other religious Jews or other religious institutions. Now, the halachic issues are going to be virtually identical, although it's interesting that on one hand it might be more chamor and on one hand it might be more mekel. It might be more chamor because when you have an organization where the money goes for the teaching of Torah, for the provision of religious services to Klal Yisrael, a term that's often used in poskim is that's called mamon hektish, that is sanctified money that Klal Yisrael is giving to these not-for-profit organizations for holy purposes, and therefore there is a concept of being extra meticulous. I remember hearing about the founding Rosh Yeshiva of Ohr Somayach, Rav Mendel Weinbach, Zichrono Livracha, who founded it together with Rav Nata Schiller, he should be well. And when Rav Mendel would go on trips for the yeshiva, he would not buy an extra Coca-Cola or whatever it would be if the vending machine was a little too high or whatever. Ad kedei kach, he was machmer. So if anything, there's the extra element of mamon hektish, which will kick in to yeshivas, aguda, and the like. On the other hand, the tzad of the kula would be that when you're dealing with a religious organization, the chilul Hashem impact of your misbehavior is not as powerful because it's a religious organization, so they know that the dishonest person is not exemplary of religious Jews. So you have perhaps less of a problem of chilul Hashem, more of a problem of mamon hektish, but in virtually any practical sense that I can imagine, the outcomes of the two situations should be identical. So halacha is certainly not going to make any difference between them.
Interesting. Well, what I'd like to do, Rabbi Breitowitz, is to ask you a number of shilas that people have sent me, or my own shilas. I'm going to mix them all up. I'm not going to point out what came from other people or things that I've encountered. But before I do that, I want to ask a general question about how a posek goes about paskening on a Choshen Mishpat shilah. Because at least what I've seen is when it comes to Hilchas Shabbos, Hilchas Nida, Kashrus, Mutar Asur, it's pretty black and white. There are grays, certainly, but relative to Choshen Mishpat, it seems there are a lot of gray areas, and we can understand the principles of Geneva, Gazela. It applies to non-Jews. It applies whether you work for an individual or a company, Geneva Stas. But when you try to apply those concepts, it seems to be a little bit difficult on the applications. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think it is fair, although application of halacha is difficult in all areas. I think Choshen Mishpat in particular has a large number of gray areas in application. The basic principles are fairly clear and to some degree even intuitive. If a person is honest, they will have a healthy intuition as to what is right and what is not right. But the reason why there's a certain complexity in complication is really for one of two reasons. Number one, there's going to be a difficult intersection with the principle of Dina de Malchus Adina, in which halacha will occasionally give deference to a secular law, which it will not do in the laws of Shabbos or the laws of marriage or divorce. And therefore, as a result, you have to kind of keep the implications of two systems in your mind, both the halachic system and the system as it may be modified by secular law. A second and related aspect is that, just as I mentioned before, a lot of these monetary prohibitions can be waived by consent, by mechila. So too there is a concept that commercial custom, prevailing practices, may be deemed a tacit mechila. So as a result, one of the difficulties a posek will have, and an employee or an employer will have, is that even if halacha says something is prohibited, perhaps that prohibition can be waived in light of common practices that are accepted in the business community. So the difficulty there is that it's often not that easy to ascertain what those customs are. The rabbi or the posek himself may not be familiar with the mores of the particular business community. So as a result, there is what you might call pure halacha, but then there's the modification of Dina de Malchus Adina and the modification of minhag, mechila, tacit consent, and all of those things. So that makes it a bit murky in terms of halacha l'maisa. When in doubt, be strict. There is no question. If you're dealing with safek d'oraisa and safek chilul Hashem, there is no question you have to err on the side of being strict. But in terms of a definitive resolution, there'll sometimes be a bit of a problem there.
Interesting. Okay, so if I can, I'll start asking questions. What I want to do is accomplish really three things by asking these questions. Number one, they're interesting. I'd love to get answers. Number two is we'd love to learn the broader concepts that can apply not only to the specific questions that are being asked, but that can apply in other contexts. And hopefully we can gain a greater sensitivity from hearing what is and what is not an issue from the responses. So starting with number one, somebody sent me the following question. He works at a large company, and they have what they call a $500 wellness subsidy. What does that mean? So what this company will do is if you spend money on gym equipment, I'm going to quote the question as it was asked to me, exercise bike. This is the definitions of what they will pay for. Exercise bike, rock climbing equipment, skydiving gear. All the things a good yeshiva boy should be buying. So what they do is the company will reimburse you back 50% of what you spend on the listed items up to $1,000 per year. So if you spend $1,000, they'll reimburse you $500. And the question was posed that this individual is an avid runner, and high-end sneakers cost a lot of money, but those are not included on the list of what is approved for the reimbursement by the company. So this individual mentioned to his manager in passing, he says, I'd like to buy sneakers and it's not covered. So the manager says as follows, just do what everyone else does. Everyone just buys a treadmill at the beginning of the year. You submit that for reimbursement, and then you go and return the treadmill, and you have a store credit. And then with the store credit, throughout the year, buy whatever you so desire. And the question was, his manager said, that's what everyone does, but it's against the policy. Can that be done halachically?
Yeah, well, first of all, I find this wellness policy to be a very interesting policy. It promotes worker health, and that itself is a very laudable objective. Here we run already into the murky areas that we addressed before. Now, obviously, to exclude running shoes, include sneakers from the reimbursement program is silly. It makes no sense, and there ought to be a discussion about modifying the rule to include it. But sof kol sof, at the end of the day, an employer can condition his grants and his reimbursements in whatever items he wants. For example, let's say an employer would have said, I will reimburse you 50% of the cost of a treadmill and cover nothing else. That would obviously be the employer's right, and for you to get reimbursed for something other than a treadmill would be taking money under false pretenses, which obviously is considered to be geneva. So the fact that the exclusion makes no sense, the fact that it's not rational, the fact that the rule should be changed, all of that is true, and indeed it should be, but that does not change the fact that it's geneva stas. Now, the only question would be, well, okay, but here, technically, you'll buy a treadmill and then turn it in. Once again, if the intention in buying the treadmill is to give it back and get reimbursed for other things, that is nichlal in what we call geneva stas. It is the obtaining of money by false pretenses. The Gemara in Chulin tells us beferish that geneva stas is prohibited even vis-a-vis a non-Jewish person. Now, the only remaining problem is that if his supervisor says everybody does it, therefore it's going to be okay, then we get into the issue of, has there been a waiver of the rule by virtue of this supervisory authority? So here, in spite of my earlier remarks, I don't think so, because there's a difference between perhaps a one-time waiver and simply saying everybody disregards a rule. I very much doubt that a supervisor can simply say, this rule doesn't apply, ignore it. The fact that everybody does it just means everybody is engaged in deceitful, immoral conduct of misrepresentation. So I really do not see a heter in this at all. I think it is geneva stas, although I would obviously be in favor of changing the rule to include sneakers.
And the fact that it was his manager that said everyone does it, is there an approval by the manager that he's not authorized?
Well, again, theoretically a manager could waive that, but I don't think that would be within the scope of his authority, because my svara is that it's one thing for a manager to say you can Xerox a few sheets of paper of her document. It's another thing to simply say that you don't have to follow the restrictions of the rule at all. Just, in fact, the way I heard you, when the manager says people buy a treadmill, they cash it in, get a store credit, he didn't even say they have to buy fitness equipment like sneakers. According to the description that the manager gave, you could keep the reimbursement if you simply bought ice cream and junk food. Clearly, that is not what the rule intends, and I can't imagine that the company would give the manager the authority to allow that type of waiver. That essentially converts a limited reimbursement to promote fitness into the ability to get $500 a year for nothing.
Right. The next question came from somebody from Boston who works as an hourly employee, and he says that he has to clock in, clock out, but what he always does is he adds time in favor of the company. So, for example, if he arrives at 9:10 in the morning, he'll log it in at 9:15 instead of 9:10. He always wants to give them more time in case he spaces out on the job or doesn't use his time as efficiently as possible. He clocks out for lunch. If he goes out to mincha, he clocks out for that also. So he said that he was meeting with his manager who reviewed his hours and said, you aren't getting paid enough. You work efficiently. You're not putting down enough hours. And the manager started making major adjustments, adding hours significantly in excess likely of what this employee was deducting, a few minutes here and a few minutes there, so he wouldn't be involved in Ginzela. So the employee pushed back on his manager. He said, I don't want you to record more hours for me. I really don't feel comfortable for that. And they went back and forth, and the manager absolutely insisted. And the employee stopped at a certain point thinking he would be making a Chilul Hashem by pushing too much. And the question now is, the hours were submitted by the manager. The employee has more money coming to him, does he have a problem, or can he accept the money?
Yeah, so here I think this is a little different than the previous case because, number one, you're dealing with an employee who, by his own statement, is actually underreporting his time out of an abundance of caution. So in all probability, the manager is probably adjusting the figure to be closer to the reality. So I think the chashash of misrepresentation is much less. Second, I think the employee has done whatever he's responsible to do. The employee has objected to this. The employee has said he didn't want this to be done. The person doing the changing is the manager. I think at some point it becomes the manager's achrayus. It is not the employee's achrayus. Particularly, I don't want to get into maybe a hot-button topic, but particularly when it comes to the issue of a non-Jewish employer, although it is absolutely clear that you are not allowed to steal and you are not allowed to misrepresent, but if you find yourself the beneficiary of somebody else's misrepresentation, you are not mechuyev to make restitution of that. Again, that's perhaps a little bit of controversy. So I would think in a case like this, where number one, even the upgrading of the time is probably not a true misrepresentation because he's been underreporting, and number two, he made the macha, he made his protest, and number three, he is really benefiting from changes effected by another party, and number four, that may in fact be within the scope of the manager's authority. I would think he is allowed to take advantage of the benefit that he gets.
Interesting. Okay, I want to move on to expensing items to the company. When can you get reimbursed? So this is a big issue. What's on me as the employee? What's on my employer? What can I put through? What can I not put through? So somebody sent in the following question. He works as a consulting firm, and he flies out, as is nahug with the major consulting firms. You fly out Monday morning, Sunday night, and you come back Thursday night. You're away all week long. So he lives in New York. He's flying out to a client located in Texas, and where he's in Texas, there's no kosher food. You can go into a supermarket, but there's nothing that is overly edible there. So what he likes to do is he orders his food Sunday, puts it on his credit card, orders it to himself, and he takes it along with him to Texas, and he's there. He eats the food that he brings with him, refrigerates it, and eats it through Thursday typically, and then he comes back to New York for the weekend and then heads back the next week. So there was 1 week he wasn't feeling well, wasn't able to eat the food. So at Thursday night, he asks the hotel that he stays at, would you mind putting this in the freezer for me? I'll be back on Monday. He comes back on Monday, and somebody at the hotel had dropped the ball, and there was his food sitting on a shelf, unrefrigerated, not frozen, and it was spoiled. And here the hotel says, we'll obviously reimburse you. It was our mistake, so it was $144 worth of food that went bad. We'll pay you. And now the question is, the policy of the employer is to reimburse for all expenses, including the food, and now he has the hotel saying that they will reimburse him for the same food. Can he get double reimbursed for the food, or does he have to instruct the hotel that ruined the food, you have to pay my employer, I'll get reimbursed from them, you'll pay the $144 to the employer because I cannot get double reimbursed for the destroyed food?
Yeah. Now here, I actually think that the employee would be able to get essentially a double dipping. He has an agreement with the employer that when he will spend money in order to buy food for his business trips, they will reimburse the cost of that food. Now, in terms of halacha, the food that he buys is his property. He makes a kinyan on it. It does not become the property of the employer. The only condition to reimbursement is that it be an expense that he incurred for the purpose of a business trip. He did incur the expense of buying that food for the purpose of a business trip. As a result, he is therefore entitled to reimbursement from the employer. The fact that the hotel was negligent or an accident happened and the food was spoiled and he got a reimbursement or he got paid the cost of the food from the hotel itself, I do not think entitles the employer to that money. because the employer did not have a kinyan or did not have a bailus in that food. Now, again, technically we could discuss various mechanisms of kinyan, but I think it's fairly clear that there was no particular maisa kinyan that would give the employer ownership of that food. An analogy that comes to mind, although it's a very, very different area, is let's say somebody is mazik my property, somebody destroys my property, but I also have insurance on it. So am I allowed to collect nizakin? Can I collect damages if I'm reimbursed by insurance? The halacha is that I can, that even though essentially I'm getting a double payment for the same item, my insurance has no bearing on the liability of that party towards me, meaning I don't say that the mazik becomes subrogated to my insurance or even vice versa, putting aside dina de malchus dina. So as a result, therefore, my right of reimbursement against my employer when I bought the food for a business trip does not depend on whether I get some reimbursement from another source. The only question I would raise, and maybe this is a question, is let's imagine the hotel wouldn't pay. Let's imagine a person buys food for a business trip and the food simply gets lost. It gets lost on the airplane. Would he be entitled to reimbursement? Now, you could raise a question that the obligation of reimbursement is only if the food is actually used. Now, if that is true, then indeed he would have to give back essentially the money that he got from the employer. And maybe that would be a question he should check with his employer. But all I would say is this. If the reimbursement is intended to be valid, even if the food is not actually consumed, the answer is not going to change because he got an extra reimbursement from the hotel. I don't consider that illegitimate double dipping. It simply means that one source of payment does not negate the entitlement to the other source of payment.
Ultimately, it's his food, not the employer's food, and if it's his food...
That's really the point. The employer did not acquire the food by reimbursing him for it.
Right. So Rav Moshe Sternbach had a similar question. He was somebody working on Pesach, and his responsibility at the office was to order food for the non-Jews on the job. Pesach, and he was ordering chametz as the person over Bal Yira and Bal Yamatz, and he said if you're ordering it on your credit card personally, you're buying it effectively for yourself. You're going to be over this or Bal Yira and Bal Yamatz, and it's considered your food.
That's right.
Interesting parallel. Okay, so I want to go on to maybe a similar question. If we have an employee, maybe a consultant, he's working on behalf of two companies, and he has overlapping expenses. I'll give an example. He goes off to a trade show. He from Los Angeles heads to New York, and he takes meetings on behalf of both of those employers that he works for. Is he permitted, again, it would be similar, to get a double reimbursement, to charge each of them for the full travel costs and his hotel and whatever else it may be, because he's working fully on each of their behalf? Each of them would have him go regardless of the other. So can he effectively double dip, get full reimbursement? And interestingly, this was one of the reasons that Ehud Olmert was indicted, was a similar thing called the Rishon Tours affair, that there was a similar scheme to that. So he happened to be indicted for that. He was let off on that claim at least. But how about in our work context? Would that be problematic, or would that not be problematic?
Well, in reality, this concept of double dipping is not as offensive to me as it might be to other people. I do work. I'm entitled to be reimbursed for that work. If the work is of equal benefit to two parties, then each one is obligated to pay whatever my fee happens to be. The problem I see, though, is a problem of Genevas Das in the lack of disclosure. And that is, it's almost certain to me that if each person would be aware that their work is being done on behalf of another party, they would negotiate for splitting of the cost instead of payment in full. So as a result, when you obtain money without a disclosure that you're also working for another party, I think there is a problem of Genevas Das. So I would think that halacha would require that you disclose the relationships and then, make your demand for two payments. Good luck. you probably will not get it under those circumstances. But that's what I see the problem is, because I don't think a normal business would agree to that double dipping had they been aware of the facts. And therefore it's incumbent upon you to give them the facts so there is no misrepresentation in the money that you're collecting.
Interesting. So I guess along a similar vein, somebody who works for a company and their policy is if you have a long trip, for example, 5 hours, you can fly business class. Otherwise, it is coach class. And the person says, I've got a flight, got to go to London. I sleep miserably on a plane. Whether I'm in business or first or coach, it doesn't matter. I cannot sleep. Now, the company is willing to pay $1,500 for my business class ticket, but why don't I just fly coach, spend $500, and I'm not going to be able to sleep regardless. So when I get to the meeting, whether I fly in an expensive ticket, less expensive ticket, I'm going to be not fresh anyway, or I can sleep equally well in both places. And what this individual would like to do is purchase the more expensive ticket, the $1,500 ticket, per company policy, expense it, and then return that ticket. It's fully refundable, and buy a cheaper ticket. He's going to go on the same flight. He's just going to sit in back, and he'd like to pocket the $1,000 difference.
You know, again, this goes back to our very first question about the treadmill and the sneakers. If an employer were to offer a $1,500 travel allowance, which could be used for airfare or used for something else, then, of course, do what you want with it. But if the employer is basically saying, hey, we're willing to pay extra if our employees are going to take business class instead of coach, then they're basically saying we are willing to reimburse you for business class. We are not willing to give you an extra $500 in your pocket. So whether the person buys a coach ticket initially or whether the person buys a business class, cashes it in, but submits the original ticket for reimbursement, there clearly is Gneva Stas. There's the obtaining of reimbursement money without proper consent. So I think the solution in a lot of these is disclosure. The old saying of Justice Brandeis, sunshine is the best infectant, and that applies to private life as well as public affairs. And see what human resources or whoever handles reimbursements, what they'll do with it. You know, again, I could certainly see this as within the scope of managerial authority to negotiate or to waive, but I think it is clearly deceptive to claim reimbursement for business class when in fact you're flying coach. So I would not consider that to be proper.
Okay, one more question about flights. If somebody properly booked a flight for business on his personal credit card, got reimbursed, but the trip was canceled. Flight non-refundable, and no other business tickets come up. There's a year term. It's about to expire. Can the employee use that ticket for his own personal use to take a vacation with his wife or husband, whichever, or do you need to let it go to waste?
Yeah, so this is interesting. We have a whole sugya in Maseches Bava Kama called Zanene V'Zelo Chasar, which basically means if I get benefits from your property, but I'm causing you no financial loss by doing so, am I accountable to pay you for this? The Gemara gives an example that you have an apartment that you're not planning on renting, and I'm simply a squatter. Do I have to pay you rent after the fact? Since I'm not costing you anything, you wouldn't have rented it anyway. And we indeed do paskin, zanen of zelo chasar is putter. One might make the argument here that if the company has already purchased the ticket, and there is no business use to which the ticket could be placed, which means to say if the ticket is not used, it will simply go le'ibud, it will not do anything at all, then for me to benefit from that ticket would be my getting benefit without causing any particular loss. So one might be tempted to conclude that zanen of zelo chasar pater. However, the problem is this. The problem is that the whole sugya of zanen of zelo chasar is referring to a b'diavad. If I went ahead and I lived in your apartment, I may be exempt from rent. but certainly lechatchila, I'm not allowed to be a squatter and I'm not allowed to be a trespasser. So if you draw that analogy, for me to take the ticket that the employer has paid for and divert the ticket to my personal use, that would be a lechatchila utilization of property that was paid for only for a business use. So I think the heter of zanen of zelo chazar would not apply. Now, the only question is, you might argue, well, but didn't I say before that just because the company reimburses you for something, that doesn't mean they have a kinyan, that doesn't mean they have an ownership. The ticket was purchased by my personal credit card. I'm assuming that that's the facts that you're giving me.
Yes.
So it's not the company's ticket. So when I use it for personal use, I'm not taking company's property. I think that's true, but you still are benefiting from a reimbursement that was made for a specific purpose, and you are using it lechatchila for another purpose. So if you want to be technical, it's not the ticket that you're misappropriating, it's the reimbursement that you are misappropriating. And the principle of zenen v'zel lo chasar will not allow you lechatchila to misappropriate that reimbursement. And therefore I think you would have to buy the ticket from the company, or once again,
consent.
The company may very well be willing to give it to you, but you need to have disclosure.
Right. I want to move on to a very common issue. Some companies have policies about not receiving gifts because there can be a very thin line between what's a gift and what's a bribe. So some companies will say any gifts have to go to the company. So somebody received a $15 Amazon gift card. And they asked somebody and said, it's inconsequential, don't bother. They're going to not think you're normal if you're offering them a $15 gift card. Everyone takes it. On the other hand, the employee handbook says that if anyone receives a gift from a vendor as a solicitation for business for whatever reason, as a gesture of appreciation, employees should notify their manager of the gift, and the manager will make a decision about it. If something is really de minimis, inconsequential, are we required still to adhere to the strict letter of the law, of the strict letter of the handbook here?
So this is an interesting question, because here the benefit being received is not from the employer, it is really from a third party. And one might initially question, who says that the employer can impose any limitation at all? Meaning it's one thing for me to receive things from my boss with Gneva Stas or whatever it is, but my boss might not be able to tell me I can't receive things from third parties. So one analogy that suggests itself is actually the halacha, that if I am a poel, if I am a person who is hired by the hour, and I find a lost object during my employment that belongs to the balabayas, so one might say that these types of benefits that are obtained in the course of business belong to the employer. But that's not a good analogy, because that only applies to a mitzvah. It does not apply to a matana. Certainly if I'm a poel and somebody gives me a gift, my employer does not have a taina or a claim to that gift, because this is what's called das acheres makna. There's a very specific intention to give it to me, if that is what the third party is intending. So one might raise a preliminary question. Do I have to obey this employment rule at all, since it does not pertain to the employer's property, the business's property? It pertains to things I receive from third parties. However, even if it may be true that intrinsically you're not obligated to obey that type of directive, if it is already in the employment manual and you agreed to that, so you would be obligated to obey, not because it intrinsically is an employer right, but simply because you were maskim as part of the totality of your agreement. It's a condition of your employment, and in a sense, you're obligated to keep all of the conditions to which you agreed. So the question then becomes, okay, how literal does that have to be? $15 and the like. So here, I do think that the concept of minhag, of prevailing practice, would in fact be very important. It's very, very clear that this rule does have a purpose. It's to prevent bribery, it's to prevent unfair, dishonest business decisions. It is based on the idea of disclosure. And obviously, therefore, those types of considerations simply do not apply to small, inconsequential, modest gifts. So in a situation where there can be a relatively clear understanding that these types of gifts within reason the company does not care about, I think you can give yourself a certain amount of leeway. Now again, disclosure is always the safest course, even if they're going to think you're crazy for asking. But, better to be safe than sorry. I would report it, and hopefully the employer will be sane. But if one did not want to report it, I think they have a makom to be somech in halacha that these types of gifts are not within the scope of the rule. Now, obviously, there's going to be line drawing. Okay, $15, not within the scope. What about $50? What about $100? At some point, a line is going to be crossed. I assume it doesn't have to be $1 million in order to trigger the rule. So there are always going to be inevitable gray areas. But I feel that $15 at least is not yet approaching that zone of
the
caution.
risk area.
That's correct. But even so, I think disclosure is the better path in all of this. First of all, there's also an idea of Kiddush Hashem. The Jewish guy is asking all of these shilas about gift cards and the like. So on one hand, your supervisor, your boss may think you're crazy. On the other hand, he'll say, wow, these Jewish guys are really so honest. I'm very, very impressed. So you actually may have the additional benefit of being Mekadesh Shem Shemayim by being maybe overly conscientious in this.
Right, interesting.
There's really no downside.
Right. I guess maybe this is a difficult question to ask right after that, but if somebody works at a company that they put in long hours and he doesn't really want people to know that he left, he wants to cut out a little bit early, so he decides to leave his jacket on his chair when he leaves early. People thinking that he's still there, is that a Genevas Das issue or is that free game?
No, that's a very, very interesting question. It certainly is creating deception, but it kind of depends on who he's trying to fool. Meaning to say, if he's trying to fool people that can determine his promotion, his salary, his responsibilities, then it absolutely is Genevas Das, because essentially he is advertising a certain qualification, i.e. that he works long hours that he doesn't really have, and that's a dishonest way of getting a promotion. If it's simply a matter that he doesn't want people to talk about him, that he left a little early, it's assuming, of course, he left when he's allowed to leave, then you are permitted to engage in a Genevas Das to prevent people from simply gossiping about you or thinking poorly about you. So I'm not sure how to gauge this here. It really would depend on who he's trying to fool, so to speak. If it's to fool the gossipers, it would be mutter. If it's to fool people who will be making decisions about him, I think that is a danger area.
And to fool both of them?
Well, as I say, if it is going to be fooling people that could make promotion decisions, then it's going to be usher.
I guess you'd have to leave half a jacket there.
Right.
And the last of these questions, that somebody goes on a business trip and you collect your receipts to get reimbursement, but he lost a receipt, two receipts, and as is common, at least when I used to travel for business, oftentimes a taxi, nowadays I don't use taxi so much, but the taxi driver, you ask for a receipt, he's too lazy to fill it out himself, and he just hands you 1, 2, 3 receipts. So I lost one receipt for a restaurant. Can I just fill out a blank receipt from that taxi driver in the same amount? So net to the company, they're not losing out, but effectively I am creating a receipt to make up for the lost one that I had.
Yeah. Interesting question. Here, technically, not only is it Genevas Das, but it's even sheker. It's not simply tacitly getting something you're not entitled to. You're actually lying, and lying is a very, very severe prohibition, even vis-a-vis a non-Jew. However, I would say in a case like this, it is actually mutter, and it's based on a principle that the Gemara in Bava Kama discusses, that is codified in the Shulchan Aruch, Avid inish dinal lenafshei b'makom pseida, that basically means that when I'm entitled to a certain amount of money, and I am not able to go to court for whatever reason, I'm not able to take the person to court, the person won't listen, etc., I am allowed to engage in self-help in order to obtain the money that I am rightfully owed. Now, this would include trespassing. This would include even breaking into an office to get what you're entitled to. And it certainly includes misrepresentation. I am owed money. I lack the documentation that will make the other person pay me. So in such a situation, since I am owed the money, it's Ovid Inish Din L'Nafshei, I am permitted to engage in what is technically a misrepresentation in order to get the money. Now, I have to be scrupulously honest. If I don't remember the exact amount, I must understate it. I'm certainly not recommending, I'm not advocating for any type of inflated receipt. But if what you're adding to another component is, in fact, exactly what you are owed or less, I believe that sheker and geneva stas would be permitted under the principle of Ovid Inish Dino L'Nafshei.
Interesting. Yeah, a lot of these questions I've asked at our Shabbos table when we have the family and guests around, and you put out these questions, and it's interesting to hear all the different views, and the views range, obviously, on each of these. Some people will say mut, or some people will say us, or some say deraisa, terrible. And I think that lends it to what we were saying about there's so much gray out there, and the need to understand the sugyas, but even more so to ask these questions. Because
well, let me point out that Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky once made a very interesting point. He was talking about the various heterim that there might be to sometimes lie, to sometimes misrepresent, whatever those parameters are. And he made an interesting point that even when halacha permits a certain amount of less than total candor, one should recognize that it can affect your neshama in a negative way. And it's kind of taking a little bit of poison into your spiritual life. So maybe I do have to qualify what I said a little bit. And that is, halacha may permit a practice, but one has to know that there's a certain danger there because you margil yourself, you habituate yourself to engage in deception, and that could lead to cutting corners. So there is what ethicists call a slippery slope in a lot of this, in which you may be starting off in a totally legitimate and permissible way, but by opening the door, la'at, you may find yourself in dangerous turf. So I could understand the ambiguity here. But in terms of basic halacha, I do believe it would be permitted.
Now, just one closing question. How do we become more sensitized to these areas? It's difficult. It's easier to shop in the office supplies cabinet to get office supplies for your kids than going to the store, cutting corners, reimbursements. So how can we become more sensitive to all of this?
Well, I think we have to recognize that if we are a religious Jew, and a religious Jew means I try to be a servant of God and I try to obey God's commandments, we have to recognize that a religious Jew, an Orthodox Jew, a Torah Jew, whatever label you want to put, is not simply somebody who keeps Shabbos and Kashrus and wears tefillin and davens, but rather all of the halachos of Bein Adam L'Chavero, the interpersonal laws of honesty, integrity in business, are that same Torah. So when we say, for example, how come an Orthodox Jew is not honest in business? One response might be, an Orthodox Jew not being honest in business is the same oxymoron as how come this Orthodox Jew eats bacon? And the answer would be, obviously, if you eat bacon, you're not an Orthodox Jew. We have to have a sense that not living up to integrity in business is just as bad, if not worse, than not keeping many of the ritual mitzvahs that we have to keep. And one has to understand how chamor this is. Remember, the generation of the flood in the time of Noach, the world was destroyed because of that dishonesty. Ne'ilah, the highlight of our Yom Kippur davening, the highlight of Yom Kippur, we're approaching the Yemei Tshuva, is Laman Nechtal Me'oshek Yadenu. We say repeatedly that God should stop us from holding on to theft of property that we're not entitled to. So I think it goes back to the idea that many people just don't regard Choshen Mishpat as part of the definition of being a religious Jew. And that's because we have an artificially restrictive definition of what makes a person from, and we need to broaden that perspective in all ways. And the same way, people want to be super machmir in Taras HaMishpacha. I mean, let me give you an example, if I could, of a case that came my way, in which somebody, this was a religious businessman in Eretz Yisrael. He was buying vitamins close to their expiration date, and he then was going to eradicate the expiration date so people wouldn't know they were buying after the expiration date. And, now granted, it's true expiration dates do not mean the medicine is worthless, but still, is there any case of Geneva Stas that's more blatant than that? And here you have a frum person who goes to a Tish on Shabbos and the like, and there literally was no Hava Amina that there was anything wrong with this. So really, I think we just have to remember that the Torah includes the Bein Adam Lamakom and the Bein Adam Lechavero, and you have to serve Hashem in all of these different ways. And as I say, just as the Chafetz Chaim kind of brought back to Klal Yisrael an awareness of the sins of Lashon Hara, so I hope that the books like yours, shows like yours, and the various Choshen Mishpat Kololim and the religious halacha institutes like in Chicago and in Lakewood, these are growing, people are sending more and more shilas, will raise the consciousness of Yidden to understand that Nasasav and Nasata B'Yamuna is a fundamental question to which we will have to give an answer after Mea V'Yesrim Shana.
Rabbi Breitowitz, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It is really my pleasure, and much hatzlacha. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Joining us now is Dr. Rivka Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz is a professional educator who designs curriculums for both elementary school and high school yeshiva students. She has a PhD from Princeton University and is a very popular speaker. Dr. Schwartz, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure to be here today.
Thank you so much. So earlier in the show, Rabbi Aharon Lopiansky stressed the importance of educating our children from a very young age as it relates to honesty and integrity. So as somebody who actually designs the curriculums for yeshiva students, we'd love to get your take on this. What can the schools do to educate our children in this regard?
So I actually want to put that question on hold for a moment. And before I talk about schools, I want to say that much more fundamentally, I think what our students learn about honesty and integrity is what they see us as their parents do. We can talk to our kids for as long as the day is long about what it means to conduct themselves with yashrus and integrity. And the first time that they see us back into and dent someone's car, look both ways, see that nobody saw us, and drive off, they've learned a more powerful lesson about integrity or honesty than all the speeches in the world that we give. The first time that we say to our child when we get to I live in New York City, you get to the subway turnstile, and they're maybe a little bit too old to ride the subway for free, just duck under the turnstile, nobody's watching, they know what all of our speeches about honesty and integrity are worth. And so before we get to the schools, I think it's really important to say that much more than what we say as teachers and much more than what we do say as parents, it's what we do as parents that's going to show our kids. I was thinking about this in preparation for this conversation, and I realized that honesty or yashrus is a midah that really only comes into play in a chips are down kind of situation. Something has to have already gone wrong or has to have already been bad in order for us to be having a conversation about honesty. Right? Hachnas Archim you can do from like a big, positive, generous spirit, come to my house for a Shabbos meal, isn't that nice? When we're having a conversation about honesty, it's already a conversation in which I messed up and I have to own it, or it's going to cost me money, or there's going to be some kind of negative outcome for me in having integrity in this situation. And if we're not morally strong enough to practice that in front of our kids, then none of the speeches we give them, not at home and not at school, are going to make any difference.
So this is something you need to show, and even if the school was hammering in on integrity, but they see something else at home, it's all for naught.
if the school is hammering it, even if the parents are hammering it, but they say, but when the rubber meets the road, when it comes to that challenging, stressful situation, oh no, I hit my shopping cart into someone's car. Am I going to leave a note on their windshield and say, I'm sorry, I caused a dent, I caused damage to your car, be in touch with me? Or are they going to see me look around, see that nobody noticed, and I'm scooting out of there? Okay, so then they know what all my speeches about integrity are worth. 100% in this area, what we model for our children, what we show them that we do, is really what's going to teach them what we really value. And there is an important role for the schools that I'm happy to talk about, particularly when it comes to academic integrity and cheating, on what the schools can do to help there. But I think that this is an area where what we do when our kids are watching us is going to have a much stronger impact than all the speeches in the world.
So the method is how you act. That's the bottom line.
The method is how you act, and I'll tell you something one step farther that my mother, Mrs. Lotte Press, who's the principal of Bnos Leah High School, often says. She says, sometimes we'd like to tell our children gedolim stories about this great figure in Klal Yisrael or that great figure in Klal Yisrael and what they did and how they modeled the midah that we want to teach our children. She said, actually, it's much more effective to tell our children stories about members of their own family and when they made a sacrifice, when they did something in order to have that midah or uphold that mitzvah or whatever it is. If we tell our children not some story about, I don't know what the Chavetz Chaim did to model integrity, but there was a time when a business opportunity came up for your father, and here's why he didn't take it, or your mother wasn't sure if this was something she was entitled to at work or not, and so she called and asked the Shaila. It's that kind of modeling for our children where they see this is something that we do in our own lives. It's part of our own family's practices and traditions and what we pride ourselves on that's really going to help inculcate it. But yes, 100%, I think that this is an area where parental modeling, where family modeling is very, very important. Not that the schools don't have a role, but again, but all the speeches in the world and all the Gedolim stories in the world, it takes one act of parental modeling of trying to skate by or avoid taking responsibility or being dishonest for the kids to see what we really mean.
Interesting. Somebody, Rabbi Yoram Sohar, who ran the largest Umpana, that's a boarding school for religious girls in Israel. He ran it for 40 years. And he told me that at his Umpana, they really tried to inculcate the importance of honesty, integrity, to the extent that they had no proctors during exams. And they let the girls take the exams. They were on the honor system, and it worked for the most part for many years. There were a few students who abused it, but for the most part there wasn't a problem. There was a time that a girl did abuse it, and the girls saw, and they made an official proclamation, there is no cheating here. It came from the students, not not from the Hanhala there, not from the administration. But he told an amazing story. One time there was a repeat offender, and she kept cheating. And he would speak with her, but to no avail. And finally he calls a meeting with the student and the mother. And during the meeting, the mother didn't know what the meeting was about. The mother's sitting there in his office, and the student is sitting there. And when she found out what the meeting was about, the mother turned to her daughter and said, "I told you not to get caught."
Oh, wow.
And Rabbi Zohar learned from that clearly what's the issue was the chinuch at home. And the chinuch was, it's okay to cheat, but just don't get caught. And once you see a lesson like that, you learn a lesson like that at home, it's very difficult to unlearn that.
And I also think that sometimes we don't think we're teaching our children to cheat, but we have to think about what the underlying message is. I have two older teenage children who are both in the early stages of driving or learning to drive now. So if your child comes to you and says, I dinged someone else's car, which again is going to happen when they're learning to drive. Obviously, you're not thrilled about it, and yes, it's going to be expensive. If you respond with such intensity that your kid is afraid to tell you the next time it happens, they may not tell you, and they may not tell the other person because they're afraid of your response. This is why Chazal tell us that a person shouldn't cause excessive fear within his household. If your household members are so afraid to come forward and tell you about something, then even though you don't think, I'm not telling my kids to cheat, of course I told my kids to let me know if they're ever in an accident or they damage someone else's car, but you respond so intensely negatively that they're actually afraid to come forward. If your child, you never told your child to cheat, but your child knows that if they get a C on that exam, you're going to respond so intensely negatively that they almost feel like they're caught or they're stuck. I'm not excusing the teenager's poor choice to cheat, but as a parent, if we convey to our kids to ultimately getting high grades is so important, and the response to them not getting high grades is so negative, then we may back them into a corner more than we want to. And so it's important not only to think about the messages that we're conscious of giving, but what educators sometimes call the hidden curriculum, the messages that we're not thinking that we're giving, but we're actually giving to our kids.
So the focus is on process. I want you to study hard. I want you to be honest, but not results, not performance.
And it might also actually be making an explicit statement to your child. I do care about performance. I want you to do well, and I do care about studying. But above everything else, I care that you're a person of integrity and yashrus. And my commitment to you is that if you come to me with the low grade honestly earned, and you're honest, and you say, I forgot to study, or I didn't study enough, or whatever it is, that I will control myself, because I don't want to be in a situation in which you feel like there's so much pressure from me about the outcome that it justifies any means that you take to get to that outcome.
Mm-hmm. And the guide for why we have to be honest, what's the basis for that?
So here I have an interesting story from my own experience in college. I went to a secular college. I was taking a calculus class that was taught in a lecture hall of a couple of hundred people. The professor didn't know our names. He didn't know who we were. And when it came time for the exam, all of us were using these fancy scientific calculators that were programmable. They had memory. You can put stuff into the memory. And, of course, you're told you're not allowed to come into the test with anything in the memory of the calculator. We were supposed to memorize certain formulas, so I did what the professor told me to do, and I memorized the formulas, only to learn after the test that basically every other kid in the class had programmed the formulas into their calculator, despite being explicitly told that they couldn't. So that's not surprising. If people would cheat, okay, that's what it is. But what's interesting to me is that clearly some of my classmates thought of themselves as honest people, as people of integrity, and yet they had done something that was an explicit violation of what the professor said they could not do. It was explicitly cheating. So I asked one of my classmates, when you programmed that formula into your calculator before the calculus test, even though the professor said it was cheating and you couldn't do it, and you did it anyway, how do you think about that? How do you justify that? How do you explain that to yourself? And my classmate said to me, well, one day I'm going to be an engineer. And when I'm an engineer, I will have a reference book to look this formula up in. I won't actually need to know it by heart. So it's not actually a meaningful requirement that I know it by heart. It was just a hoop the professor gave us to jump through. And therefore, I thought I was justified in programming it into the memory. And what I took away from that very brief conversation that stayed with me for more than 20 years is that if the only barometer is your internal definition of right and wrong, it's very easy, for the sake of convenience, to redefine it, that even explicit cheating isn't cheating. No, I'm not cheating. It's just the professor made an unreasonable requirement, and so it's valid or legitimate for me not to follow it. It's only when we're responding to an external imperative that I know this is what I have to do because I have to do it. This is what I have to do because Hashem commanded me midvar sheker tirchak. This is what I have to do because Hashem commanded me not to steal. This is what I have to do because there is an external standard that I have to measure up to, that I will actually be sure to maintain it. If it's an internal standard, there are a lot of people walking around saying, yes, of course I'm a person of integrity or honesty, but who conveniently managed to redefine that for themselves in the circumstance, in the situation. Yes, I know I hit his car. I keep using cars as a metaphor because it comes up so often. I hit his car, I dinged his car, but he shouldn't have been parked there anyway, so therefore it's really valid and legitimate for me not to leave him a note and not to pay for the damage that I did. When it's only defined by my own internal sense is very flexible when it comes to something that's going to be advantageous for me. And if I'm responding to an outside imperative, a mitzvah, a commandment, a mitzvah, Hashem says I have to do this and I can't do that, that's when that will carry me through, even in the situations where it's difficult or it's challenging or it's going to cost me money.
So we rationalize things. That's human nature. So unless we have an external, if we have a Rav, somebody to ask our shilas to a third party that knows what the halacha is, then it's very easy to rationalize everything, especially when it comes to money.
And what's so interesting to me is that people, I'm sure somewhere there's somebody who says, yes, I'm a cheater, I cheat, and I get away with it. But most people don't say that. Most people will give you complicated, convoluted explanations as to why their dishonesty isn't in fact dishonesty. They've created some internal story that they tell themselves to rationalize it, to explain it, why it's okay, and it's why it's fine. And it's only when you're holding yourself to an external standard that's not going to be flexible in response to your circumstances that you're actually going to make sure that you're acting with appropriate integrity and honesty all the time.
So that's going to be applicable whether somebody's a child in school or taking a calculus class in university, or somebody's out there in the business world. Those same concepts are going to apply across the board there.
Absolutely. There's so much at stake. There's such a potential gain or loss. If I just have to cut a little corner here and think about all the good that I could accomplish and it's only when somebody outside says to you, well, you're not allowed to do that. And it actually doesn't matter what the potential gain or loss is. That's not something that a Torah observant Jew is permitted to do. That helps recalibrate.
Right. Now, when we get out in the quote-unquote real world, we're going against the grain. We're going against the current because there's a lot of dishonesty out there. And I want to use that concept of you being basically the only person in that calculus class who was not dishonest. How did you feel in that environment? Because ultimately, it's working against you.
So I will say I wish I had a greater sense that it was only out there and not in our community as well. I think it's more pervasive than that. I was a teenager in New York City in the 1990s when the stealing the Regent scandals, people who are old enough and who remember this, the New York State exams, and people used to get their hands on the answer sheets to the New York State exams before the exams. One year, the New York Post actually published the answer key to the chemistry regents on the front page of the New York Post the day of the chemistry regents. They had to cancel the chemistry regents in New York State that year. And unfortunately, yeshiva students, members of the frum community, were often involved in that regents thievery, and because we justify it and we explain it and we whatever it is. So I wish I thought it was only out there, not in here too. It's in here also, but I will say I think that is where the challenge for schools comes in. Because if you're somebody who is a student trying to conduct herself with integrity and not cheat, and all around you students are cutting corners, copying each other's work, cheating on exams, whatever it is, you're going to end up feeling like a fool, like a loser, right? You're taking the hit on your grade. Everybody else is being advantaged by whatever they're doing that's not Ehrlich, and you're the one who's kind of being hurt by it. And so that's where I think the responsibility of the schools comes in. There's always going to be one kid who's more determined to cheat than I am to catch him. And I'm not going to be able to catch him. He's really determined to cheat. I'm not talking about that one kid. But there's going to be a whole bunch of kids in the middle where if the structures are set up to support integrity and to make it easier to conduct yourself in a way that's honest, they will. And if the structures exist that kind of encourage cheating and encourage lack of academic integrity, and you feel like a loser if you don't take advantage of that because everybody else seems to be, so then you might feel like you have to kind of keep up or keep down, as the case may be, and not disadvantage yourself in that way. And where I think the responsibility of the schools comes in, I'm not much less in like the speeches about honesty, and much more in setting up structures that support those kids who want to be honest, and certainly keep away from creating a norm where like everybody cheats, and if you don't cheat, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. And there are a lot of different ways that schools can do this, and I actually think that it's an important responsibility that we as schools owe to the kids and owe to the chinuch of the kids, that we don't allow it to become an environment in which cheating is so pervasive that becomes the norm, in which it's almost, it's hard not to. It's a lifnei iver situation. It's a mayas haben v'lo yechata situation, and that's where I think the responsibility of the schools comes in.
Okay, so that's if there's endemic institutional cheating, but how does the school deal with it if there are yechidim that are cheating?
So, but before we talk about yechidim for a second, what does your proctoring for exams look like? Is a teacher sitting in front of the room, reading a book, grading their test, and ignoring what's going on? Or is a teacher actively proctoring? That sounds like that's some kind of small detail, but it's not. It's about what kind of environment you create. Do you have teachers who've been giving the same test for 30 years, and the tests are all out all over the community, and everybody knows that the test is out there, but somehow the teacher is still giving the same test? There are a lot of things like that again, sound like they're structural or they're nitpicky or they're just details, but they really are. Are we creating an environment in which it's almost inviting kids to cheat and then we can tut about them when they do, or are we creating an environment which we're saying we actually support academic integrity and honesty? For individual kids who engage in violations of academic integrity, we try on a first offense to say to the student, this can potentially be a learning experience. Here's why this isn't okay. Here's why it can't happen again. Consequences escalate from one offense to the next, but at a certain point you get to the point where you say to the student, doesn't seem like you're understanding us or what we're talking about here, and this is really a problem. So, we have in my school, in SAR High School, we have a policy. The first offense, you failed that particular assignment. And then, it sort of escalates from there. But it certainly comes with education and conversation. We don't just want to penalize a student. We also want to say, here's why this is wrong and here's why this is a problem. And I will sometimes say to a student, the least important thing that happened here is the grade you got on this history paper. The real question is what kind of a person you want to be. We're trying to help you be the kind of adult who is responsible, who is honest, whose word can be trusted, and that's way more important than any grade you get on a history paper. And we hope that students hear us and learn from us. But that's already in a context in which we are trying to create an environment, and what that looks like will be different in different schools. There are schools that have an honor code of no proctoring during exams. If it is deeply entrenched in the culture of the school, it can work. To just come into a school that may already have a cheating problem and say, okay, we're starting an honor code, there will be no proctors during an exam. I can't imagine how that would work.
It would not.
Right. In other schools, like the school that I'm in, the culture is not that we have an honor code with no proctoring, but that we try to have vigilant proctoring so that students feel like we're actually trying to support the kids who want to make the right choices. And the individuals, again, who are really, really committed, teenagers are very creative and very resourceful, and the few who are very committed are very committed. But it has been my experience that is a very few, and that there's a much larger number who will respond to the incentives and the structures that we create around them.
And this is just one final question. Maybe this is a no-brainer, but have you seen a direct correlation between those who do see honesty, integrity at home, and as supported at the school when they grow up? What's the impact on them?
It's impossible for me to know who's seeing honesty and integrity at home. Again, it's so many small things that are not transparent to me. It's how you engage in those everyday interactions. It's what you model for your children in so many small day-to-day interactions. I don't know what students are seeing at home. I can't tell, or I can't comment on that. I can see students for whom it's clear that they have absorbed this as a value in the ways that they talk and conduct themselves, and I can see students where they experience a sense of the pressure is so great that they have to do whatever they have to do in order to get the desired end. And again, that can be a pressure in school, that can be a pressure about grades, and later on in adult life, that can be a pressure about finances. But when we get into a circumstance where we feel like the pressure is so great that any means to an end is justified, that's where people find themselves in very compromised situations.
Wow. Okay. Dr. Schwartz, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Joining us now is Charlie Harary. Charlie runs a large management consulting business, spent many years as an executive at a large real estate company. He started out as a New York attorney, and he is well known worldwide as a tremendous inspirational speaker. Charlie, thank you so much for joining us.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Charlie, why don't we start with Chazal? Chazal tell us that Rov begezel, the majority of people steal, and unfortunately, things have not changed much since the time of Chazal. I saw some statistics recently that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce estimates that 75% of employees steal from the workplace, and most do it repeatedly. Now, we're not only talking about office supplies here. There's a lot of false disclosure, for example, when it comes to interviewing or when raising money, which you have a lot of experience having been in real estate investment, genevas das, people applying for government grants and benefits. There are numerous applications to the need to be honest in the business realm. You have worked at a number of places. You've really been around the block when it comes to business. Are these problems and issues that you've seen firsthand?
Yeah, I mean, it's all over the place, obviously. I think it comes down to something even more fundamental in that people, I don't think, either appreciate their actions as much as they should or their words as much as they should. When it comes to business, obviously, the most important thing someone needs to do when it comes to business is understand that everything comes from the Kadosh Baruch Hu, right? Well, I remember one time getting advice from Rav Busu from Eretz Yisrael. He said to me that the greatest illusion in the world is that there's a connection between hishtadlus and parnasa, right? Like when you're a kid growing up and someone steals your nose, and then you get a little older and you're like, that's a trick, and then someone loses their finger. As you get older and you go through the magic tricks of life, as a person grows up, they start to realize that that's an illusion, that card trick's not there, there's a trapdoor behind that box. And they get older and older and they realize that what they thought was real was really an illusion. And I think, for me at least, what changed at least my life is that when Rav Busu explained to me that there's no connection really between parnasa and hishtadlus. that what you do every single day is part of a gzera, that you have to do something. That's how Hashem tests you, to see how you act. How much money you make, that's a whole other cheshbon. That's part of your tikkun neshama, that's probably from your shalom bayis, how much stuff you give. There's a whole cheshbon in Shemayim for how much you give. But when you don't understand that, when you actually think that your actions are going to somehow change your future, someone going to put more money in your pocket, and when you don't take what you're doing seriously enough, if you look at a pen and you look at a copy, or you look at some words and go, what's the big deal? That's that combination of thinking that I'm going to control how much I make and what's the big deal creates an environment where people are always sort of pushing the boundaries to put a little more in their pocket, thinking that it's gonna, if no one's looking or it doesn't really matter, then it'll go into their pocket. And that's just, I think, in many cases, sort of normal for the world, from what I've seen.
When it comes to the small stuff, the financial integrity, do you really think that the coworkers are looking at this stuff?
Oh my gosh! If someone walks around with a visibly Jewish attire, and we don't realize this. It's like parenting, right? Like no parents realize that when the husband and wife are having the conversation in the front of the minivan, like 3 kids are like soaking in every really word, right? Like no one realizes that. Nobody realizes that. Like when you're online for an ice cream store, and the way you treat the lady is going to be exactly how your kids act to the people. Like no parent realizes the impact that they have on their children until they see their kids get older. I believe no frum Jew realizes the impact that they have on the people around them. Like they have no clue just how the world sees them and understands them, or doesn't understand them, but sees them and looks to them and judges them and judges Hashem by them. I can't tell you some of the stories I've had with people where like a very religious looking Jew would do X or Y, and other people in the office would come to me and go, like, can you just like talk this through with me? Like I'm having like how is that possible? Like he's a man of faith. And conversely, like stories of people that are visibly from, that do things beyond for other people, and they get their benevolence and be like, wow. Like almost to the point of like, blessed is the God of the Hebrews, like almost to that level. We don't appreciate it because when we wake up in the morning, we're so used to ourselves. And when you go to shul, there's so many of us. And if you live in a very saturated Jewish community, everyone around you is like you. And if you work in an office with lots of people that are from someone else, someone's looking at somebody else, it's very hard to understand that whatever we do is being looked at by somebody, not just the Eibishter, by somebody who's judging faith based on our actions. And the reason is because for us, we live in what I would call like a clergy-ish world, like we're a mamlechas kohanim v'goy kadosh, which means that when we grow up in a frum community, we're all sort of clergy in a way, right? Like lots of regular balabatim can give shiur, and lots of regular balabatim kadam for the amid, and lots of regular balabatim walk around and dress in a way that shows their faith. If you go out to the rest of the world, you don't really have that as much. The people that can get up and lead services and can give classes and show their faith are usually the clergy. So for us, it's normal that we walk around with faith everywhere. But that's not how it works for the rest of the world, even for the rest of the Jewish world. So when you see somebody that walks around and prays and eats certain foods and wears his faith on the outside, in the mind of everybody but a frum Jew, that person is representing God. He's clergy, even though he may also be a doctor and a lawyer and an Indian chief. And therefore, when they act, it's like as if the clergy is acting. And so everything that we're doing is being scrutinized, whether it's conscious or subconscious, by somebody else, and determining if either our faith or if faith is consistent with activities and actions. And when it is, there's a certain resonance and that, okay, makes sense. And when there isn't, it's even worse because there's like a hypocrisy that sort of gets into the either conscious or subconscious of the person watching and goes, that just doesn't make any sense. And then either it's the Jewish God or Judaism, or it's just faith in general that gets thrown for them.
So they see us cutting corners and just not having the integrity that would otherwise be expected from somebody who's observant. And we're talking whether it be a man or women at work. It really not only they not only look at that specific attribute of us, but they look at us as a whole as representing Klal Yisrael.
Yeah, it goes further. I mean, yes, Klal Yisrael for sure, but to some people it represents God. Like there are people out there that are Jewish and not religious, and they look at us, and you don't know. Sometimes you don't know if they're Jewish, not religious. You don't even know, and they look, or they're related to somebody that's Jewish, not and they look at you, and you're not just representing Klal Yisrael, you're representing the Ribono Shel Olam. Right? That's even big. Like it's Hashem, and they're trying to figure out if Hashem makes sense in this world, if a life of faith makes sense, if a life of faith is right, if it's just. Right? If you look around to people and ask them why they struggle with faith, most people struggle with faith because of the world, right? How the Holocaust is the biggest kash on their Ribono Shel Olam. Why? Because why would God do this to people? It's social justice that drives people crazy when it comes to faith. And so when a person is walking the streets with a yarmulke on his head, and he is not engaged in what we would call justice or acts that are just or right, it breaks the whole system down of why faith is important. For an average person, for a frum Jew, when you ask someone about faith and Yiddishkeit, in their head they're thinking davening, learning, rituals, ben adam l'makom. For a secular person, when you ask them about religion, a lot of it, I mean, they have rituals, but they're not machshav it. A lot of it is social justice. It's doing what's right. It's taking care of people. So when a frum Jew does something in the world of breaking down social justice, in his head he may be thinking, but I'm davening mincha, but I'm going to give tzedakah, I'm going to do ben adam l'makoms all day. But to the person who's watching, they don't have any of that. So they're thinking, whoa, the whole system doesn't make it. If this is what this guy's doing, then the whole system of religion doesn't seem to be working. And it has tremendous implications on people. I remember years ago somebody said to me that the greatest thing you can do for your career is learn Sha'ar B'tachon fully through it at least once a year. Like you have to be able to like chazer and chazer and chazer Sha'ar B'tachon so many times that you live it, you breathe it, it's in your head. Halavai, I should get there one day, but like, I'm learning it. The question is, do I live it? That's a whole other question. But if a person doesn't walk around with that level of emunah and bitachon clear, that the Eibush is in my life right now, he's going to give me the money that I need, and there's no concept of me like sort of hiding under the table that's not going to ultimately end up coming back to bite me at some point. That's, I think, the only way, because at the end of the day, if you don't have that level of bitachon, the Kodesh Baruch Hu is going to be taking care of you. He's going to give you exactly what you need, and he wants you to do the best that you can. And a lot of the reasons why you're in this world maybe is because to overcome challenges of mammonas. It's hard for a yid to like not live this way because, like you said, there's pressures, and he comes back with the money, and it's an issue of identity and hatzlacha. There's so many things that cut to being able to be successful financially that are in line with the communal needs, that becomes very hard otherwise.
Yeah, with Rosh Hashanah coming up and HaKadosh Baruch Hu sets everyone's level of income for the coming year, I guess it's an opportune time to really work on that emunah and bitachon. Yes,
one of the biggest principles I believe in, it's all through the Seforim of Pnimius and Chassidus, is this idea of emunah hi ha'amshacha, which is that there's a concept that you have certain bracha that's being given to you, right? You daven for something and it's given to you, but you can't. A lot of times the shefa doesn't come down to you. You have to draw it down. Hamshacha is the concept of drawing down. So how do you draw down shefa from wherever it is in Shemayim into the world? So there's a concept through the Seforim which speaks about this again and again, where the drawer, if you will, the code for your ATM, the spiritual ATM machine, is emunah. And there's a lot of times where the Kodesh Baruch Hu gives you what you want. You ask for parnasa, you ask for help, and he gives it to you. And you have you've got $1 million in the ATM, but you don't know the code, so the money ain't coming into your pocket. And the code is emunah. Emunah hi ha'amshacha. And if a person goes through life without that emunah, thinking that I got this, it's in my hands, and the Kodesh Baruch Hu's not looking, it could very well be that the money was coming to him anyways, but he just couldn't hold back, and he had to take it in a way that doesn't work. So now he gets in the wrong way. He's got to deal with that. But that was coming to him no matter what. And had he just waited and done it right, he would have got the exact same amount put in his pocket. It was given to him Rosh Hashanah. And it would have been done b'nachas and with bracha and with shafran. To the extent in which we do things that are wrong and usher and God forbid, and in addition to that, cause Chil Hashem in this world, well, we can't possibly think that the things that we benefit from that are not going to poison our soul. And it's not going to block us from the shefa that we really want. They're not going to block us from the bracha that we want. So there's a very specific holistic approach towards Yiddishkeit, which is I got to be clean. And that's the concept of being a tahor. I need cleanliness. And when I'm clean in how I act, and I'm clean in what I do, and I'm clean in how I work, that cleanliness, that tahara, is what allows the shefa to come into my life. I remember years ago I went to a big tzaddik in Yerushalayim for a bracha, and he said to me, the way shefa works, again, this is all stuff like, this is Nista stuff, I don't know how much you want to go through this stuff, but like, there's something called a tzinoor, and a tzinoor is sort of a spiritual pathway or pipe for how Hashem sends bracha down. And if you fill that tzinoor with dirt, whether that's lack of emunah or stealing, then the water, if you can almost imagine, comes through the pipe, but it just comes out dirty. And that's a tremendous thing in life, right? Because you can get things in life, but it comes with stuff. It comes with a little dirtiness. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't come with bracha and shefa and good things. We want good things in life. We all want to have enough money to live. We all want to have enough money to make ourselves feel good. We all want to walk to shul. I feel like we're matzliach. Nobody wants to walk to shul and see that everyone's matzliach but him. Nobody really wants his family to not have the things for Yantif. Nobody wants to suffer, and nobody wants his family to not have what everybody else has. We're human beings. We want to make it in this world. And making it today's day is not just putting food on the table. Making it in some communities means much more. But if we don't root inside ourselves a real seder of emunah and bitachon, if we're going through our days and we're not breaking our head over the fact that the Eibishter runs the world and what does that mean in bitachon, it becomes much harder to go through life. In everything in life, but for sure with money. The greatest thing if the more we realize, and our wives realize, and our kids realize, the Kodesh Baruch Hu runs the world. He's giving us what he wants from us. We're going to do our best. We're going to work our hardest. We're not going to be lazy. We're not going to take the shortcuts. We're going to do everything kedas v'kedin. We're going to work our hardest. But at the end of the day, the one who determines parnasa, the key of parnasa, marantinus, is the Eibishter. And if he wants us to be wealthy, he'll give it to us. And if he doesn't, we can do anything in the world, and he won't. And our job in life is to just push down the road as honestly and as studiously as possible, and hope that the Kodesh Baruch Hu responds in kind. And if he does, we know we get it with Shef and Bracha, and we give a lot of tzedakah. And if he doesn't, we know that's our tikkun neshama, and we got to suffer, and we got to go through that. And if you have that mentality, you walk through. You're different in business, and if you don't, you're different in business. It's like two different human beings, and you see this, by the way, with everything in life. You know, I know people in life that were from when I started working with them in the law firms. By the time we got through 4 or 5 years of being associates, they were answering emails on Shabbos. Like, they were answering emails on Shabbos because, like, that's the pressure. And they weren't strong enough in their rituals, Yiddishkeit. So they said, okay, listen, what am I going to do? Like, I'm not working, but, like, it's an email. Like, maybe there's, like, a heter, blah, 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 blah. So if you're strong and you believe that Kodesh Baruch Hu gives you parnasa, as you get through life and people throw stuff your way, you look at it and you see the Kodesh Baruch Hu right behind you smiling at you going, don't take the bait. Trust me, don't take the bait. If you're meant for it, it's coming to you. And if you're not meant for it, it's not coming for you. But let me tell you one thing. Don't get lost along the way.
Right. Thank you so much, Charlie. Thank you. Really appreciate you joining us on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye. Just like to invite Rabbi Breitowitz back onto the show. I just wanted to get his perspective on an issue that we actually started the show with. I mentioned that both my brother and I have different perspectives on what would be a proper use of company assets, for example, using the printer or the Xerox machine at work. And I told the following story. There was a time that I was flying back from New York to Yerushalayim, and I asked my brother to print out my boarding pass. And he said his typical policy is that he doesn't use anything at work for his personal use, but he understood that I needed it. So he said he would make an exception, but he would be sure to replace the piece of paper that he used at work, because he didn't want to use a company asset for something personal. He would replace the piece of paper. I'm sure that he made them whole as well on the ink and the electricity, but my typical perspective is as long as the use is reasonable, not too much, a reasonable amount, that would be acceptable. And I wanted to get Rabbi Breitowitz's view, what is the proper perspective al pi halacha?
Yeah, well, first of all, I do want to say how enormously impressed I am by your brother's integrity, and he's certainly a role model and an example for how Jewish people ought to behave, and really all people ought to behave in the business world and in their personal lives. But I do have to agree with you that as a matter of technical halacha, he does not have to be as strict as he was. It is understood in the modern world that relatively inconsequential personal use is generally tolerated and accepted unless there is an explicit rule of the company to the contrary. So as a result, your brother's behavior was not halachically required, but would certainly be in the spirit of going beyond the letter of the law, and in that way can certainly be a source of Kiddush Hashem and inspiration for others. But,
so that would be a Midas Chasidus, in other words.
Midas Chasidus, that's correct.
Okay, I think I want to switch camps to his camp at this point.
Well, I would like to be on his side, certainly.
I agree with that. Terrific. Thank you so much again, Rabbi Breitowitz. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
My pleasure, and much hatzlacha. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
The winner of the riddle from last week is Eliezer Shapiro, who gave the following response.
First riddle relates to the pasuk of Kol Shlala Kabeit El Teich Rechava V'Sarafta Ba'esh Es Ha'ir. The din of Ir Nidachas, that the city has to be burned down. And the Gemara says in Sanhedrin, Dafayin Aleph, the Gemara says, B'Shem Rabbi Eliezer, that a city that has a mezuzah, Eina Nasis Ir Hanidachas. Why? Because the pasuk says, "It's called Shlala Tikva Etzel Teich Ha'ir V'Sarafta Ba'esh," and the mezuzah were not allowed to burn. It says L'Sasum Kein LaHashem Elokeichem. So from here, that you're not allowed to be Meichek Shem Hashem. And that's why an Ir Nidachas that has a mezuzah is not burnt down based on the mitzvah Torah. And the question is, why didn't we say here Asay Docha Lo Asay? The principle Chol Torah is a mitzvahs asay, is doicha mitzvahs lo asay. Over here we have a mitzvahs asay of Vesarafta, to burn down the city, and this mitzvahs asay should be doicha the lo asay of lo sasam ken Hashem Elokeichem. So the whole city should be burned, even with a mezuzah, because of asay doicha lo asay.
Hi, my name is Eliezer Shapiro. I'm calling from Baltimore, and I want to answer one of the riddles that was just asked on this last show. Asay docha lo saseh only works from only works as a regular lo saseh, like kilai and betitus. But lo sasum l'Hashem Elokeichem is not a regular lo saseh. The Harary, the Gemara in Eilo Mitzios, when it talks about Kabed es Avicha, and it compares it Kabed es Hashem Elohecha, that is a super powerful asay, and that's not considered a regular asay. The Gemara in Eilo Mitzios talks about that, that such an asay might be considered stronger than a regular asay. So therefore, I'm showing you, when it comes to kavod shamayim, lo sasem l'Hashem Elokeichem, that's not equivalent to a regular lo saseh of kilayim b'titus, mila b'taras. So therefore, we will not say asay docha lo saseh for ir hanidachas. Okay, thank you for the great question. Kol tuv hatzlach.